Good day. Today's lecture is devoted to presentation as a method of mastering language. This topic is especially important because language learning in higher education should not be reduced to the memorization of isolated forms. On the contrary, it must lead students toward meaningful speech production, interpretive work with texts, and the ability to transform information into coherent discourse. Therefore, presentation should be regarded not merely as a speaking task, but as a pedagogical method that unites reading, analysis, selection, reformulation, and verbal expression. To begin with, the presentation is defined here in three interconnected ways. First, its etymology, derived from the Latin presentatio, points to the act of presenting something new before an audience. Second, it is described as a creative act, since it allows for verbal self-expression and the realization of communicative intention. Third, it should be understood as a structured form of speech activity with a clear communicative purpose. Accordingly, a presentation is not simply a spoken report. Rather, it is a pedagogically organized act of language production in which information is selected, arranged, and expressed for others. This slide deepens the previous definition by stressing that a presentation is more than a speech in the ordinary sense. It is presented as the final product of intensive text work. In such courses as Russia, history, and culture, students prepare presentations while working with material related to architecture, cultural artifacts, regional history, and local historical context. Thus, the educational value of presentation lies in its synthetic nature. It demands not only linguistic skill, but also intellectual processing of content, thematic selection, and communicative shaping of knowledge. A key idea is introduced here. Language mastery is understood as a process of transformation. The diagram indicates movement from word to word, from source to reader, and finally from reader to author in the form of a text presentation. This progression is especially significant because it shows that mastery develops through active restructuring of meaning. In other words, the learner does not remain in the stage of reception. Rather, the learner gradually becomes capable of producing a new verbal product on the basis of processed and reinterpreted material. Therefore, presentation serves as a culminating form of active language appropriation. The slide identifies three generative operations particularly relevant to presentation work: adding, omitting, and rearranging. Adding introduces new lexical units or elements that enrich the developing meaning. Omitting removes redundant material in order to produce clarity and concentration. Rearranging restructures the flow of the text so that the final form acquires stronger logical sequence. These operations are pedagogically important because presentation is never a mere repetition of the source. It is a transformed product, and this transformation requires conscious linguistic and compositional work. The next slide places presentation within a psycholinguistic framework. Several cognitive operations are emphasized: analysis and synthesis, generalization, abstraction, and concretization. Analysis and synthesis allow the learner to break down and reconstruct textual meaning. Generalization reveals broader patterns within diverse material. Abstraction extracts central ideas, whereas concretization gives those ideas verbal and contextual form. Consequently, presentation is not simply an oral exercise. It is a cognitively demanding activity in which language production depends on the disciplined reworking of thought. This slide presents a more detailed set of reconstruction operations: exclusion, quoting, combination, compression, and replacement. Exclusion removes insignificant material. Quoting highlights selected fragments. Combination unites separate elements into a new whole. Compression simplifies without loss of essential meaning. Replacement introduces synonyms or equivalent active speech forms. Taken together, these operations reveal the internal mechanics of presentation work. The learner must not only understand the text, but also actively reshape it in accordance with communicative purpose. A particularly important pedagogical transition is emphasized here: the movement from reader to author. The slide argues that when reading includes transformation, the student ceases to be a passive consumer and becomes the creator of a new speech-thinking product. This idea deserves special attention. In language teaching, true mastery begins when comprehension is followed by productive re-expression. Therefore, presentation becomes a marker of intellectual and linguistic independence, since it requires the learner to assume authorial responsibility for meaning. The present slide focuses specifically on compression as an integral part of understanding. By simplifying the source text, students internalize language structures more deeply. At the same time, the slide warns that inadequate understanding leads to distortion of meaning, whereas correct transformation confirms successful cognitive activity. Thus, compression is not a superficial reduction. On the contrary, it is a test of real comprehension. If the learner can preserve essential meaning while reducing verbal complexity, this indicates both conceptual clarity and linguistic control. This slide develops the previous idea by showing that transformation excludes less significant information in order to prioritize the target message. The reference to Ellen Chalian's information levels underscores that text work always involves hierarchy. Some elements are central, others are secondary. Accordingly, the task of the learner is not to reproduce every detail indiscriminately, but to distinguish the essential from the incidental. In this respect, presentation teaches informational discipline as well as linguistic expression. The lecture then turns to a practical case study drawn from cultural history, namely the city of Kostroma. This example is methodologically useful because it demonstrates how presentation work can be grounded in concrete cultural material and not merely in abstract linguistic exercises. Through such material, students are required to work simultaneously with fact, context, vocabulary, and verbal organization. Therefore, presentation becomes both a language task and a means of cultural interpretation. The specific example here concerns the Epiphany Cathedral as a significant unit of historical and cultural heritage. The slide also points to the importance of factual precision, supported by visual materials such as maps and albums. This is pedagogically significant because presentation in language teaching must remain grounded in accurate content. Language mastery is strengthened when words are connected to real cultural objects and historically meaningful reference points. The next slide stresses the necessity of factual accuracy. Errors in dates or other historical details are described not as minor inaccuracies but as distortions of meaning. This is an important methodological reminder: language education cannot be separated from truthfulness of conveyed content. Therefore, mastering language also requires mastery of the factual realities it communicates. Precision in information is, accordingly, part of linguistic responsibility. The lecture concludes its thematic development by returning to the teacher's role. The teacher is presented as the guide who helps students work through lexical nuance, distinguish close meanings, connect words with cultural concepts, and replace passive units with active speech forms. This role is central because presentation as a pedagogical method does not arise automatically from student effort alone. It requires guidance, lexical clarification, and deliberate support in transforming language from passive knowledge into active communicative use. Thank you for your attention. I hope this lecture has clarified the pedagogical value of presentation as a method of mastering language and has shown how text transformation, cognitive processing, and verbal creativity can be united within one educational form.